We'd like to invite our listeners to attend our annual benefit dinner for the Doc Booth Foundation on April 12th at 6 p.m. at the Dixie Convention Center. This year, we're honoring the great Mary Esther Staheli Putnam, who has been a pillar in this community. If you can attend or would like to donate, you can buy tickets at docboothfoundation.org.
I don't know whether people are good when they come to Pine Valley to live or whether it's Pine Valley that makes them good after they're there.
Oh, once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know.
Welcome to Not Forgotten, a weekly podcast sharing the stories of a place known as Utah's Dixie, and brought to you by the Doc Booth Foundation. Through stories as universal as they are personal, this podcast is dedicated to the memory of legendary family physician Dr. Craig Booth and to defining, preserving, and perpetuating the spirit of Dixie embodied in his life and work.
Hi, I'm Lyman Hafen, host of the Not Forgotten podcast. For more than 40 years, I've been writing and publishing with the intent of connecting landscape and story in the American Southwest. I believe the words spoken by a character in a story by Barry Lopez. Everything is held together by stories, he said. That is all that is holding us together, stories and compassion. Dr. Craig Booth was a man of stories and compassion. His personal story is one of the many that have made Utah's Dixie what it is, and his compassion is at the heart of that elusive entity we call the Dixie Spirit. Today we're going to talk about Pine Valley, that beautiful village in the valley called Pine Valley, 32 miles north of St. George. We have the privilege today of visiting with Mary Esther Gardner Staheli Putnum. We'll get into our visit with Mary Esther here in just a moment. But in order to set this up a little bit, I wanted to share a piece from my book, Where Two Streams Meet, called Land of the Mountains High. Between 1913 and 1933, while living in a house that still stands on Tabernacle Street, my grandmother gave birth to 14 children. I don't have all the birth dates in front of me, but I know many of her pregnancies spanned the summer months when this little town broiled beneath the heat-charged ridges of black volcanic rock and red sandstone. I asked my father once how Grandma survived those long summers of confinement before air conditioning. His response was quite matter-of-fact and made complete sense. Grandpa would arrange for her a place to stay in Pine Valley, he said. For centuries, Southern Paiutes had summered in that high, lush valley where water and game were abundant. But the pastoral, alpine setting we know today as Pine Valley was unknown to Euro-Americans until the summer of 1855, when a man in search of a cow stumbled upon it, quite by accident. In 1854, Brigham Young had sent missionaries to the southern edge of the Great Basin to establish the settlement of Harmony and to work with the Southern Paiute Indians there. Some of the missionaries spilled over the edge of the basin, moving down the Virgin River to the confluence of the Santa Clara, where Jacob Hamlin began his legendary work among the Shivwits band of the Southern Paiute. It was a hot and barren country, and the mission sought summer grazing ground for their cattle in the mountains to the north. In the summer of 1855, Jacob Hamlin's brother, Gunlock Bill, and Isaac Riddle were caring for the mission cattle when one cow came up missing. Riddle left the herd in search of the cow. He trailed her higher and higher up the Santa Clara until he topped a ridge and gazed in silent awe at the magnificent scene before him. He later stated, "There, stretching before me, was the most beautiful sight I had ever beheld on God's green earth." Isaac Riddle didn't just find a lost cow that day. He discovered a valley that within a year would begin playing a vital role in not only the survival of the Indian mission at Santa Clara, but the soon-to-be established cotton mission at Washington and St. George. Ever since that day, this picturesque valley on the north side of the laccolithic dome known as Pine Valley Mountain has been crucial to the success of the historic communities of Washington County. It was the headwaters of the Santa Clara River, providing drinking water and irrigation to scores of settlers. It was prime grazing ground for beef cattle and an ideal location for producing much-needed dairy products. And it afforded an abundant stand of tall pine trees that provided the prime lumber needed to build the county and fuel its economy. At 6,700 feet above sea level, the town of Pine Valley was a stark and welcome contrast to the searing heat of St. George, Santa Clara, and Washington at little more than 2,000 feet and a mere 32 miles away. During a visit south in the spring of 1861, Brigham Young had a perfect view of Pine Valley Mountain when he stopped his entourage near the confluence of the Virgin and Santa Clara rivers and declared that someday a city would fill the space between the two volcanic ridges streaming southward from the base of the mountain. By then, Brigham was well aware of the bounteous resources of Pine Valley. By March of 1856, Jehu Blackburn and Company had erected a sawmill in Pine Valley. Blackburn, along with Isaac Riddle, C.W. Dalton, Robert Ritchie, and Lorenzo Roundy, were turning out large quantities of high-quality lumber by 1857, providing Washington, Santa Clara, Harmony, and Pinto with lumber and shingles. The southern settlers also discovered that Pine Valley was not only a good place for their cattle to summer, but a place for themselves to find respite as well. During the summer of 1856, Jacob Hamlin spent as much time as he could with his family in Pine Valley. In early August, his wife Rachel gave birth to a baby girl, Rachel Tamer Hamlin, the first white child born there. For decades thereafter, until air conditioning became common, many southern Utah women, including my grandmother, spent their summer confinement in Pine Valley. Among the 28 families that came to the town of Washington to grow cotton in 1857 were several who ended up in Pine Valley: John and George Hawley, William R. Slade, Robert L. Lloyd, Joseph Hatfield, and Umstead Rencher had proven that cotton could be grown in Washington, as well as sugar cane and other tropical plants. But by 1859, due to drought and limited resources in Washington, they were looking for greener pastures, and they found them, literally, at Pine Valley. Rencher ended up in Grass Valley, just north of Pine Valley, where he established a very successful dairy operation that made him wealthy during the mining boom at Pioche, Nevada. As the years passed, more and more people moved to the Pine Valley area to work in the lumber business and in farming and ranching. The first meeting house in the valley was a log building with a dirt roof built in 1859. A post office was established the same year. With the onset of the Civil War in 1861, Brigham Young decided to enhance the cotton mission with the establishment of St. George. In late 1861, he sent a group of hand-picked families to build a city on the same alkali slopes between the volcanic ridges where he had made his declaration earlier that year. St. George would be the beneficiary of Pine Valley's abundant resources and also a catalyst for growth in the mountain valley. Erastus Snow, the apostle who headed up the Southern Mission, knew that Pine Valley's resources would be vital to the success of the struggling communities. He called Robert Gardner to go to Pine Valley and take charge of a lumber mill. More than a century and a half later, the names Gardner and Snow are still synonymous with Pine Valley. In spite of hardships and tragedy, the town of Pine Valley slowly grew during the 1860s and 70s. Practically all the lumber used to build the Latter-day Saint towns south of the Great Basin came from Pine Valley. It wasn't until the 1870s that another lumber source was developed at Mount Trumbull, Arizona, about 75 miles south of St. George, where beams of a length needed to build the St. George Temple were found. Meanwhile, some of Pine Valley's excellent lumber was being used for very special purposes, such as construction of the stately tabernacle in St. George. In fact, a certain type of yellow pine was found in Left Hand Fork in Pine Valley Canyon, just the type needed to build the soon-to-be famous organ in the Salt Lake Tabernacle. Robert Gardner went into the canyon and handpicked the trees according to specifications sent from Salt Lake City. The trees were felled and sawed into lengths suitable for hauling. Gardner's daughter Sarah and William Meeks, who were planning to be married in the endowment house in Salt Lake City, transported the logs north on their wedding journey. But Pine Valley lumber was never put to a more worthy use than to build the beloved Pine Valley Church and School. The logs for the framework were selected from a grove of particularly tall, straight pines. They were hand-hewn and put together with auger holes and wooden pins. The building's artfully curved ceiling and the arch over the stage harmonized perfectly. Its simplicity of design was drawn from New England churches familiar to many of the town's settlers. It is one of the most perfectly designed and beautifully placed buildings ever erected by the Latter-day Saint pioneers, and it has served as a chapel for the faithful from the day it was dedicated to the present. During much of the 20th century, Pine Valley was perpetuated by ranching families who continued to utilize the lush valley meadows and the excellent forest grazing. Today, though, much reduced, the ranching tradition continues in families that trace their Pine Valley roots back 5 or 6 generations. But more than anything, Pine Valley today is a bedroom community for people who work in St. George. The 32-mile commute is a small price to pay for the serenity, beauty, and cooler temperatures of this pastoral mountain valley. Though it might seem like a modern notion, it's an idea Jacob and Rachel Hamlin came up with a long time ago. It's just such a wonderful day to be here with Mary Esther. And I call her Mary Esther. She's been a dear friend and someone I've known and loved all my life. Mary Esther Gardner Staheli Putnam. And Mary Esther's life is the quintessential Dixie life, I believe. And we're blessed to have you here to visit with us, Mary Esther. And there are so many things we could talk about. But what I'd really love to focus on today is Pine Valley, that beloved place. And I know that's where you grew up. I know that your roots are generations deep there. And you've written a beautiful book about Pine Valley. You live there now. And perhaps we could just start. Maybe tell us how and when you came into this world and that world of Pine Valley that you were born into.
Well, I was born over 80 years ago in St. George at my grandfather, George F. Whitehead's home. I think that address is 141 North. It's just above the boulevard and First West. It's now part of the Seven Wives Inn, I think. And my parents lived in Pine Valley during the growing season. And by the time I came along, I'm fifth of 5 children, oldest brother and 3 older sisters. And by the time I came along, the family, I understand, had moved several times during the winters to different places in St. George, but they had finally built a home at 159 North, 1st West in St. George. And we'd come there shortly after school started so that we could attend school and begin the Dixie spirit, if you will, because there was no school in Enterprise and nothing in Diamond Valley like there is now. And I think they had some kind of a school bus that came as far as Central. And they had a covered pickup truck that had benches in the back that picked up the 4, 5, or 6, however many kids there were in Pine Valley every morning for the month or 2 that we stayed there. Because when I came along, my dad became a scout and someone who took care of California deer hunters. So we had to leave the house by deer season so that Dad could escort the deer hunters who didn't know how to even bridle a horse. We've heard fun stories about the deer hunters that came to our house. And then we've spent the winter in St. George when they moved the cattle out and when the harvest of the potatoes and the crops were in. And then went back in the spring a month or so before school was out. So we've had that same routine the whole time. We experienced moving day, and Mother was very strict about how every box and every piece of furniture and whatever went into the back of I think they used a horse trailer for a trailer to move all the stuff back and forth from St. George to Pine Valley and back. And when we were riding the school bus, we'd get so excited when we'd get to Vail on the way back in the afternoons. I could hardly wait to get to Pine Valley, to go up on the hill and find my horse so I could ride. And now, when I go back to Pine Valley after I've been in St. George, I'm so excited to get there because my home is on that hill where the horses used to roam. And growing up, we were friends and neighbors with everybody who was there. We went to church in the little white church building, and when we were young teenagers, we'd sit on the back row and look out the window because across the street were the 2 Snow sisters, Liz Beckstrom, who was married to Veer, and her sister, who never married, lived across the street to the west, and her name was Bessie Snow. She taught library science at Woodward for years and years. Well, Liz lived close enough to the church that she waited until she heard the organ music before she opened her front door, walked down the path and out the picket fence gate, and we'd sit on the back row of the chapel and look out to see if Liz had heard the music, so she was on her way across the street to come to church. And my mother played that pump organ in the Pine Valley Chapel for over 40 years. And as we speak, I'm privileged to do that 1 month out of every 3 months now. Howard and I did the music together for probably 10 or 12 years until his eyesight became bad enough that he couldn't do it anymore. And it took 3 or 4 couples to replace us, we jokingly say. And I'm quite happy to be able to, first of all, to attend meetings in that chapel, which unfortunately is going to end. Apparently in August, they'll have the chapel finished in Central, and we'll be going 7 miles to Central to go to church.
And that building has been the longest continuously...
continuously used building in the church. It's not the oldest, I don't think, but because it's been in continual use. It was a ward until 1954, somewhere in there. And then as families moved away for employment or for the winters and whatnot, we took our memberships, brought them to St. George, and it became a summer group. And it wasn't until 2003, I think, or 2004, there were enough people there that they decided they were going to make it a senior branch. And we met in a tent for 7 months out behind the building while they restored the foundations and put in heating and air conditioning. And President Holland came down, I'm thinking it was 2004, and rededicated the building. And eventually they had local people doing the Sunday afternoon and other days during the week tours of the chapel, like the historic buildings in St. George. But they let local people be those tour guides, and so we'd take them through the chapel, and we'd tell them, well, the church is really true in Pine Valley. In fact, we feel like we're the celestial kingdom. And so we're still doing that at this point, and local people in Pine Valley are able to do that and sign up for days that they will do that. But I grew up with lots of friends in Pine Valley, and I challenged the boys in town, R.J. Snow, who's no longer living, and Judd Burgess, who's gone, and Ted Snow. Ted and I used to sit up on the rocks behind our house in the evenings and solve all the problems of the world. And he's gone, and now his son Courtney and his wife Kaylin, who was a Brooks, Warren's sister, have built a beautiful home on the site where Ted and his family, Bruce and Emma Snow, lived. And that ancestry goes back to the same great-grandfather that I have, Robert Gardner, had built 3 homes in Pine Valley. One that Ted Snow grew up in, the one that I grew up in, and across the street to the north, the one that one of my dear friends who's gone, Christy, and it's her daughter who lives in that house that became the home of Malin Cox.
Mary Esther, you're bringing us up to the Pine Valley of today, and I'd like to come back to that because Pine Valley has become quite a place. But let's go back. Let's go back in time. You were born into this beautiful celestial valley.
We sometimes call it a little Swiss village.
Yes. However, you were what generation? You're third, fourth?
Dean Gardner and I, who is Ras Gardner's son, Dean and I are double second cousins. He's Larry's father.
Uh-huh.
So goes back to my father, say Robert Gardner, and then Hiram Osro is my grandfather. Rex is my father. So 4 generations from Robert coming to Dixie.
So there have already been 4 generations there. Mm-hmm. And obviously there were many generations of the Southern Paiute who loved that valley and were part of that valley. But among the LDS, original LDS settlers, you were 4th generation or so. Mm-hmm. Take us back those 4 generations to Robert Gardner and maybe just tell us how all that came to be.
Well, Robert Gardner was called to come to Dixie, and that's where the Dixie spirit started, was with those, was it 301 families who came, if you go out to the university?
I usually say over 300. I've heard different numbers, 308, 309.
Where the monument is yes. Out to the university and whatnot. They were going to plant cotton, and he was responsible in large part for the lumber for the tabernacle and the temple and whatnot, and had to have a place for his families. There's some really good stories in his journal, and I've got a little of his story in the book that I wrote, The Descendants of Pine Valley Pioneers, about how he had 3 families in Pine Valley and another one in St. George. And at one point, he was worried about his family in Pine Valley because of the weather, and he walked pretty much all the way, had to stop overnight somewhere. I don't have all of, the details to make sure that his family was okay. And then he had that terrible accident while he was felling the lumber and bringing it down the hill. And I'm not sure whether that story was in Pine Valley or whether it was up in Mill Creek, up Salt Lake area, because they have a Robert Gardner home in Mill Creek. But he slid a piece of fallen lumber down the hill, and it got him on the leg and cut his leg to the bone. And they had to take him. They thought they weren't going to save him. They wanted him to have a drink of alcohol to numb what they were going to try and sew up his leg. And he just said no and had him pour it onto his leg and almost had to help him sew up his leg. And then they put him in a room without much ventilation and almost died for lack of oxygen. I mean, that's not the same language that the story's written in, and raised his family there. And I don't know how much different it was for them than even when I grew up. We had a wood stove that my mother cooked on. I'd go out in the mornings. One of my jobs was to get the kindling in the wood bucket from out where Dad chopped the wood to go in the stove. And on Mondays, we washed, and we had a concrete stove kind of thing that had holes for the wash tubs, and lye soap to wash the clothes in, and a plunger to, like, quite a bit not like the ones of today. In one tub, and in the other tub it was just the rinse water. Of course, we always had to try and get our clothes out of the wash and get them on the line before the neighbor next door did theirs, so we could get it done early. Some kind of competition. And we went up on the hill to the chicken coop to feed the chickens, had to go to the granary to get the grain to take to the chickens. And I don't know how far we want to go with the WC, but we had outdoor plumbing. And they had essentially the same things a generation or two before then, I would guess.
So you were in that bridge from pioneer times, which you experienced as a little girl, into today's world. That's amazing. And as you look back at that family history, the Gardners, there were the Snows, there were other families that were prominent there that established that community. Could you share more about that?
Well, it was Robert Gardner and William Snow and the Beckstroms, and there were other families I didn't know real well, but when I decided I wanted to find out more about the people I called aunt and uncle, that was when I did some interviewing for that book, because most of the people in Pine Valley, to one degree or another, were aunt and uncle to me through the Snows and the Gardners. And the Burgesses, I was good friends with Jerry Burgess, Dennis Iverson's wife, and then her brother was my age, Judd Burgess. And we had a Forest Service in Pine Valley that they had a family in there every year, and sometimes they stayed several years. And I became friends with Merrill and Noel, whose father was the forest ranger, and they were there during our teenage years. And we just did kids' things. We didn't have asphalt roads. We just went and got our horses. I'd go up on the hill with a handful of grain, and the horse would come. I'd jump on the back of the horse and take him down to the stable and put a bridle on him and jump on and ride to the neighbor's house. I went to Janice Burgess's house was 8 blocks, so I figured it was almost a mile. I don't think it's quite a mile, but that's a long ways to walk now. But we would go on horseback to visit with our friends. And Liz Beckstrom and Bessie Snow were both well-read because they were librarians. I would go to their homes and go to their shelves to get books to read, and spent hours with the classics like Little Women and books like that. And we we just associated more or less like one big family. Like it takes a community to raise a child, and that's what it... And I was thinking the other night and thinking about this, and I thought, I can remember when I was old enough to be on a horse and be able to get back on, so I'd have to have been 7 or 8 years old, when Dean Gardner was the bishop, and I had an envelope with my tithing in that I got on my horse and rode my horse up to Dean's house. Happens to be the one I think that Alan owns now. It's an old white, can't remember now the ancestor who had that house, and got off the horse and took my nickel of tithing to Dean. I was so proud to be able to pay my tithing. And we all got up on Sunday and went to church, and because they used the glass cups after Sunday school and we'd partaken of the sacrament, we had an opportunity, I don't know whether it was every other week or however much, to take the cups home and wash the sacrament cups and then take them back, because we had sacrament twice a day, once in the 10 o'clock Sunday school and once in the 2 o'clock church in the afternoons.
Mary Esther, I didn't realize that...
You didn't realize I was that old.
No, not that you would be that old, but that you had those experiences as a child. You're a Dixie girl, and and I've always known you living here in the Valley or in Washington, but your formative years were right there in that beautiful,
and I didn't ever want to leave, even when I wasn't there all the time. I went back, and for 26 years during the summer, I taught Sunday school, the 12-year-olds to the 18-year-olds. And I'm not sure what I taught them, but I just always wanted to be in Pine Valley, I think.
I mean, that's perfectly understandable. You were born in St. George, obviously, but your eyes were opened as a child in that valley. Mm-hmm. So that was the world that you came into. I guess what I'm trying to get at here is, for those of us who come into that place for the first time and see it, it's just overwhelming, just like it was for Isaac Riddle.
When he Gunlock Bill Hamlin.
Yeah, when they first came in and said, this is, I can't remember the phrase, but the most beautiful place on God's green earth. And yet for you, that was just your backyard.
What you're saying and what I think I'm hearing is we didn't realize how good we really had it.
I guess what I'm getting at is that feeling still the same?
Oh, yeah.
Even though you've lived there most of your life?
I'm up and down the road almost every day, and I get to the corner of the chapel where I turn right, and I feel like I'm home. And I think, that's where so-and-so used to live, and this person's moved in, and so they're like Pine Valley. The people, I don't know whether people are good when they come to Pine Valley to live, or whether it's Pine Valley that makes them good after they're there. But there's a lot of people now that have moved into that little valley that don't have family ties there. But it's a really, the feeling in Pine Valley is awesome.
And it's still there.
Oh, it's still there. Must be the Dixie spirit.
Well, let's talk about that, Mary Esther, because you alluded it right at the beginning that you came down to St. George and that Dixie spirit began to be part of you. And I guess it goes both ways. You brought that spirit of Pine Valley. Yes. And when you look at what the Dixie spirit is, it really is all of these communities that worked together to survive in those early years. And Pine Valley really played a crucial role in St. George getting on its feet. I mean, those 300 families came and they had nothing, but at least you were growing some potatoes in Pine Valley, and you had lumber and you had resources that could help this fledgling community.
Well, and as you were saying that, I was thinking about coming down here to school And I think we must have stayed with Grandma and Grandpa Whitehead before Mom moved down from Pine Valley. And because I remember going there for lunch, and she'd put what we called Nuco then, the top of the milk, the cream, on a slice of bread and put sugar on it. Anyway, I remember going to Grandma's house for lunch, and I must have stayed there. I had an aunt who lived upstairs in Grandma's house. Her name was Edna. She married Ray Bentley, and he died when I was about 10 years old, and so she stayed there until a little while before she died. But the school was just 2.5 blocks to the south of our house. And so I went to the elementary school there and started to enjoy all the kids that lived in St. George. And then I went to Woodward. And when I was in Woodward, I wanted to be involved in music, and my mother had insisted I practice the piano, but wanted to be in the band, so we rented a clarinet, and when the people that we'd rented it from wanted it back, Stan Smoot says, well, we'll just make you the majorette for the marching band. And I won't go into detail about that because it was not wonderful. But however, the ball games, the PE out on the grounds where the library is now, and I don't want to get into the radiation and the cancer thing, but I've got a picture of Gay Armstrong in our PE class, all the girls dressed in their PE uniforms out on the lawn exercising, which was just about the same time that atomic bomb, or the bomb, whatever, the cloud went over. And I mean, have many good St. George friends. They love to come to Pine Valley and visit too. But going back to Pine Valley, as little kids and as grown-up kids, in fact, my kids now even realize that's important.
And so you were here in St. George, and at some point you met a guy named Frank. When did that start?
I'm trying to see if I can even remember the first time I met him. Must have been at a dance. He was quite a dancer. And he had a good time, and anyway, we started to date, and I think we both could see it was going somewhere. He had dated someone else, and I had too, but we ended up together. He's 3 years older than I am, so I didn't know him in school. I'd have to go back and think a little bit about how I didn't know any of his sisters. They're a little younger than I am, but it turned out to be a fairly good match. I love that family, and I'll always be a Staheli.
Full disclosure here, we're talking about Frank Staheli, who happens to be my first cousin.
And so now you and I are
Mary
cousins.
Esther and I are cousins, and Frank and Mary Esther raised an amazing family. You lived a lot of those years in Washington.
Raised my family in Washington. I moved out of Washington when I was going to marry Howard Putnam. And Frank had been gone 12 years. And so all the kids grew up in Washington, went to church there, and have long-time friendships there with their friends.
I have a memory of you, Mary Esther, you and Frank, at Grandma and Grandpa Hafen's house, A.K. and Arilla Hafen.
By the way,
he Frank's grandparents.
He was the patriarch who gave me my patriarchal blessing.
Wonderful. I remember, I'm not going to get into ages here, but I was younger.
Yeah, quite a bit.
And I remember being at Grandma's house, and you and Frank, a young married couple, came to visit. I remember that very vividly. The reason I remember it so well is because you had just gotten home from Vietnam. You had come to visit Grandma and Grandpa to tell them about your experience in Vietnam, and I was sitting in that room listening to you talk. And I don't remember details. I just remember how how amazed I was, how awesome it was, the two of you.
That we had
and
lived in another country.
You had lived in another country, that you had these experiences. And I remember how Grandma and Grandpa were so enthralled to hear and to know
and
what you had experienced.
And did you know that I went back this last year and took my kids?
No, I did not.
The two children who were born in Vietnam, Frank is 61 and Annette just turned 60. And in March, I wanted to take them back to their homeland, so we went on a tour and we're in Vietnam for 4 or 5 days, and it was really special.
That is awesome.
But yeah, we went with the government, with the United States Operations Mission when Frank was in the National Guard, and that's how he...
And this was before the war, or at least
yes,
before...
I came home when President Johnson sent the dependents home. I didn't want to come home. I sent Frank over to the military compound to get me a bag of flour because I was mixing bread or something. He came home and he says, "You don't need this flour, you're going home." And I said, "Wait, what?" He says, "Yeah, they're sending all the dependents home because it looks like there's going to be turmoil." And so I got it packed up and got on one of those cargo planes and came home about 3 months before he did.
My goodness. Well, and I guess I'm thinking, so here you are, a young married couple. You grew up in Pine Valley. Mm-hmm. You've had this world experience on literally the other side of the world, and then you're back. That has to have given you a lot of perspective.
I love to travel. I'd go anywhere and stay for a length of time, but I'd always point myself back to Pine Valley and memories of growing up and the principles of faith and hope and charity that were instilled in us. I know on Testimony Sundays in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, people will stand and be thankful. And I always want to be careful because everybody has a story, everybody has a history, everybody has a heritage. But we all that are local will occasionally stand. We're so grateful for our Pine Valley heritage, and we don't want to belittle anyone else. And I'm sure that people have kind, good thoughts about growing up, but don't think of anything negative. Even Lee Beckstrom, who used to answer the phone when we'd ring the dial on the phone, ours was a long and 2 shorts, and everybody in town would know you were on the phone, and he'd answer the phone. "This is Sister Hughes." I better not get into stories. Rattle around.
Oh, that's great. I think that your story, Mary Esther, is so wonderful and so indicative of what all of this is. That
there's something. I don't know if it's in the water or if it's just the history of the area or how hard people worked in the beginning and they've instilled that in us.
And just that idea of service and everyone pulling their weight where they've been to pull it. And you've done that in so many ways in your life, with your music and with your many aspects of your service. But I think that probably all goes back to your childhood in Pine Valley.
I guess it's better than just sitting on the couch.
Mary Esther, you've experienced so much in your life, including the tragedy, the loss of your first husband, Frank, his untimely death, and how you proceeded forward from that point in your life. Could you share some of your thoughts about that?
Frank died very young. He was just 50. He would have been 51 in a few days, and it was a very unfortunate farming accident. And we had to keep going. I was teaching school, and the kids were going to school. They were involved in sports, and I didn't maybe take enough time or any time to deal with any emotional impact that the children had because we had to get up and have breakfast and get dressed and go on about the activities. and went on that way for 12 years. And the way I met Howard Putnam would probably be another long story. So anyway, we managed to get together, and as he had asked me to marry him because his wife had died just over a year before that, very unexpectedly with a brain aneurysm, I think they called it. And I had already planned a trip with some friends. There's 8 of us who call ourselves the San Francisco Girls, and for about 15 years we went to San Francisco every year. And we were in the shuttle on the way to Las Vegas to meet the airplane, and I said, I have something to tell you. And I said, I'm going to marry Howard Putnam, and you would have thought the world had come to an end. Those girls said, what? And one of them said, that will be the most politically correct marriage in the county. So it ended up that with my 7 children and his 9 children, and then we hadn't been married, let's see, we were married in 1998, and it was 2001 or 2, I can't remember. We accepted a call to serve a mission in Russia. Well, the kids that we taught English to in a school in eastern Russia, in Khabarovsk, which was in the Vladivostok mission, when they asked us, we talked about children, none of them believed that we had that many children. But that was one of our first getting to know you experiences, was going almost around the world on an LDS mission. It was a humanitarian mission, teaching English and dealing with the wheelchairs that they were doing with humanitarian and whatnot. Howard was not excited about that because he couldn't sing in Russian. And he had a beautiful tenor voice and liked to sing, but he didn't know Russian well enough to sing. But
there's so many of us who remember Howard and his musical contributions in this whole Dixie area. In fact, even back to kindergarten, I remember him coming as a.
It was like Mr. Rogers.
I think he might have still been in school, but he was coming. He came to our kindergarten class and taught us music and brought a whole box of instruments.
Well, and he had an auto harp that after he died, one of his girls says, is that auto harp still around? And she got it and took it home. But that the first way that I knew that family, one of my sons is a year different in ages than one of his. And one of my daughters double dated with one of his daughters. And then with the little bit of choral music that I knew, I used to participate in the Community Messiah. And he was either singing one of the solos or conducting, and his wife Martine was at the piano. And she and I served on a Stake Relief Society board together at one time. So there's lots of little stories interacting and intertwined, but we lived in Pine Valley for most of the time that we were married. In fact, he passed away in Pine Valley.
And then Frank, I just remember Frank as larger than life.
He was a hayfen.
His mom was a hayfen.
His mom was a hayfen.
His mom was my dad's oldest sister and beloved, wonderful, wonderful Karma. But Frank, he was mayor of Washington
for a while. Yes,
and he was a farmer. He was a veteran. He was all of these things that I just always looked up to him as a hero. Well, a great athlete. Didn't even mention that.
But his athletic career ended fairly early, too, because a cousin from Enterprise tackled him in a football practice and broke his leg, and he was in a cast for 9 months, and he never went back into...
Oh, my goodness. Wow. I guess what I'm saying Mary Esther, is you're the thread through all of this awesome story.
Oh, well.
And it's a story that begins in Pine Valley, and it circles back to Pine Valley.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's where your heart is.
Mm-hmm.
And what an amazing place. It is absolutely beautiful, and I'm sure that's why everyone wants to be there.
And there's a lot of people who want to be there. There's some big homes up there, and there's people that we have a state-of-the-art fire department and EMTs to take care of all the senior citizens. And there is a special feeling in Pine Valley that I think is much the same as the county area Dixie spirit. And I don't know that the rivalry between Iron County and Washington County has anything to do with the Dixie spirit or not, but it's definitely in our makeup. There's no question. And Craig Booth is a big part of that. And maybe part of the reason I'm even here or involved with this foundation is because of our love for him. He was instrumental in the mental and emotional health, I think, of at least one of my children at a certain time. And when I was alone living in Pine Valley, a time or two when there was snow on the ground, I'd look out, and one day, it's the only time I've ever been on a snowmobile, I looked out, and there's Craig Booth on his snowmobile, and I went to the door and said, "Whatever are you doing?" He says, "Come on, get on. I'm going to take you for a ride." So we headed west on the west end of Pine Valley and up to, it's not Box, I can't remember the name of the canyon, on the west side of Pine Valley, and rode all around. And I thought, this has got to be safe, or he wouldn't be doing this. And I was kind of scared to death, but he was just that kind of a guy. And even lots of times Maureen would be busy with things, and he'd be in Pine Valley sitting out on his patio reading books like War and Peace, and I'd recommend books occasionally. Say, "Oh, I've read that one. Have you read this one?" And come on. And then he'd call and say, "Come on over and sit and visit." And we'd sit and visit for a long time. And Lisa Provostgard had come by, and she'd come and sit down. Then we'd talk about the days she worked for him in his office. And more often than not, when he was up there, I felt like I was his very favorite until he got talking about all the people that he'd visited that morning as he rode his four-wheeler around Pine Valley, and what everybody was doing. But he'd pull up in the driveway, and Howard would look out, and he'd say, "Your friend's out there." I'd walk out and sit on the railing on the porch, and he'd sit crossways of his four-wheeler. And I don't think we talked about everybody in town, but we had a good time. And he was just one of those. And I think that's why this Doc Booth Foundation is set up to perpetuate the memory that goes along with where we saw him sit on the stadium seats at the Dixie ball games. And whenever they were playing Pineview in recent history, my youngest daughter would go sit by him, and she'd almost want to slap him because he'd cheer for Dixie when they were playing Pineview or when they were playing Snow Canyon. You could always tell where he was, and sitting on the benches, and he knew everybody and talked to the coaches and knew the kids. And one of my daughters played basketball with his daughter Brittany when they were in high school. So anyway.
Really appreciate you sharing those stories and those thoughts, because it is true that Doc Booth is at the heart of all of this. And if you really want to define that Dixie spirit, it's really defined in him.
Well, and because he felt comfortable around people, and I think he knew that I would be there sometimes when he needed something. One day he called me, he said, "Are you ladies still walking in Pine Valley?" I said, "Yeah, you want to come walk with us?" And it was a snowy, snowy morning. I've got the picture somewhere, and we parked at the reservoir and walked up around the campground. He got in the car, he had an umbrella, and we all had our yak tracks on so that we wouldn't slip in the snow. And I think there were 4 or 5 inches of snow, and it was snowing, and Doc Booth walking up, telling jokes and talking about people and how fun they were and telling stories. And then he called me a couple of times. He says, I've got some friends here, and we're going to go walk up the White Elephant Trail and up onto the mountain in Pine Valley, and we need a ride. So will you come drop us off up at the campground?
Mary Esther, it strikes me you've had the best of all worlds.
No kidding.
your childhood in Pine Valley, and then much of your adult life on the south side of that mountain. Mm-hmm. But now you're back there. And I've always thought of that amazing mountain. People always wonder, why do you call a mountain Pine Valley Mountain?
Because it belongs to us.
Because it's the mountain above Pine Valley. But I've always thought of that amazing, that purple mountain's majesty when I hear that song. And for me, it's always been Pine Valley Mountain is that purple mountain's majesty. But I've always thought of it also as kind of the sacred heart of Dixie. If you think about the lifeblood of Dixie or of any town is water, and the water that rushes off the slopes of that mountain and that gushes out of the springs at its foot.
And we've got one of those springs in our yard.
Really?
And it's been running all those generations as far as we know, until maybe this year.
But there wouldn't be a Dixie without that mountain.
Without the water that comes.
And we're blessed. We're blessed to be here. And Ricky and I are blessed today to have you here in this studio and sharing your beautiful spirit, Mary Esther.
Oh, I always get more than I give.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sitting down with us today. We love you, Mary Esther. Appreciate you so much.
The Doc Booth Foundation is dedicated to empowering individuals through educational opportunities and promoting mental health advocacy. Through scholarships and funding for important community needs, the foundation perpetuates the can-do spirit of the founders of this community, using the lessons of the past to chart the course for a better future. Make your tax-deductible donation at docboothfoundation.org. Not Forgotten is produced by Ricky Valadez and made possible by the generous support of St. George Area Zag Stores, industry-leading tech support and accessories. Lyman Hafen's books can be found at lymanhafen.com.
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. We came to Dixie and we called it home.